Thank you all for being here today. Welcome to this virtual space convened by UC Berkeley's Cannabis Research Center. My name is Michael Polson. I'm an anthropologist and research scientist in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. For those of you who don't know, the Cannabis Research Center has been around since 2017. And since then, we've been addressing some of the more urgent, thorny questions around cannabis agriculture, farming communities, environment, and policy. I invite you to check out our website, crc.berkeley.edu, to dive into our resource pages, fact sheets, archives of past events and webinars, and the 40+ articles we've published on this long prohibited and now burgeoning field of cannabis research. You can also sign up for our newsletter on the bottom of our homepage. Today, it's my pleasure to bring you this webinar on the possibilities and limits of cannabis rescheduling. I'll leave it to Dr. Amanda Reiman, our skilled moderator, to set the stage. But just a few words from my perspective. I first came to understand the medicinal power of cannabis living in a small community in Northern California 20 years ago. Through friends, many of them queer, living with HIV, chronic pain, disabling digestive conditions, and other ailments, I learned about the history of patient activists that had doggedly asserted the value of cannabis in a medical, political, and legal system that discounted and criminalized it. As an anthropologist, I'll note that before it was medical, cannabis was a folk medicine. That is to say, it was from everyday folk practitioners who were often derided as quacks that our society has come to accept and legitimize the medicinal value of the cannabis plant. Now, on the cusp of rescheduling cannabis from Schedule I, defined as a drug with no currently accepted use and high potential for abuse, to Schedule III, a shift that finally recognizes the medicinal value of cannabis, we would do well to remember that this conversation and all that follows rescheduling stands on the shoulders of those patient activists. I say this not to memorialize, but to center patient activism in conversation, to ask how rescheduling can best reflect the longstanding goals of access, justice, and healing in the rough wake of the war on drugs. Today, we're going to be exploring the sweeping ramifications of rescheduling. We constructed today's panel to give insight into key affected areas: policymaking, industry dynamics, patient access, research, and medical practice. Thank you to the Resources Legacy Fund for making possible our work at the Cannabis Research Center. And also a big thank you to Joanna Hossack and Peng Lor for their hard work organizing this panel, and also to our moderator, Dr. Amanda Reiman. In a time when medical cannabis was treated with skepticism, Dr. Reiman was conducting research on cannabis dispensaries and path-clearing work on cannabis as a substitute for alcohol and other drugs. Since then, she's worn many, many hats, but it's all long been working to legitimize and legalize cannabis, medical and otherwise. Before turning it over to Amanda, a few instructions for audience members. There's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions as we go. The inimitable Joanna Hossack will be collecting these questions and feeding them to Dr. Reiman when the time comes. Also, there's a react button if you'd like to share your reactions as we go. This webinar is going to be recorded and reposted to our YouTube channel, which I encourage you all to subscribe to today. Without further ado, here's Amanda.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. So I'm Amanda Reiman. I am currently the Chief Knowledge Officer for New Frontier Data, which is a data and analytics company that serves the legal cannabis space. But it's such a pleasure for me to come and do this specifically at the Berkeley Cannabis Research Center. As Michael said, I've been researching cannabis now for over 20 years. And when I did my doctoral dissertation at UC Berkeley in 2005-2006 on medical cannabis dispensaries, there was no Cannabis Research Center. So to see this grow out in my alma mater and the attention that's being paid to this, especially in a state like California, which has been such a cornerstone of cannabis industry, activism, and history, it's really, really special opportunity. So it's a little bit like coming home for me, even though I don't live in California anymore. I live in Washington State. So when we decided to do this webinar today, we know that there's been a lot of talk about rescheduling, pretty much since it was announced that there was going to be review of the evidence by the Department of Health and Human Services. Everybody has been questioning and wondering, what does rescheduling mean? And it is absolutely historic. Ever since the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, which established drug schedules, there have been requests to review the Schedule I status of cannabis. So the schedules that were developed out of the Controlled Substances Act were based on three criteria: the medical value of the drug in question, the potential for abuse, and the level of safety or the safety profile of the substance. Substances in Schedule I were purported to have no accepted medical value, to be at high risk for addiction, and to be too dangerous to use even under the care of a doctor. Now, we could do a whole other webinar on the social and political factors that placed cannabis in Schedule I in the first place. If you happen to be in Berkeley, they have a whole shelf on it in the library where you can go and read some of the original transcripts and petitions to try to get cannabis out of Schedule I. But here we are in 2024, and this opportunity has finally come. Now, there's many out there who think that Schedule III does not go far enough, and we will talk about that during today's webinar. But I will also say that the government and movement, especially social movement, is rarely, if ever, a straight line. And this is by no means the end of the conversation. In fact, this is the very beginning of a conversation that we have been waiting 50 years to have. So as Michael mentioned, we have some amazing panelists, and we're going to give them each an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves. Then I'm going to ask some questions, and then we're going to hear questions from you. You have an amazing opportunity here to have the ear of some of the leaders in different sectors of the cannabis space, and we really look forward to your questions. So with that, I'm going to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. And Daniele, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, Amanda. Great seeing all of you. So my name is Daniele Piomelli. I'm Distinguished Professor of Anatomy and Neurobiology at University of California, Irvine. I've been here for 26 years, and for the last 30 years, even before I came here, I've been working on endocannabinoids and cannabinoid pharmacology. And currently, my lab, in addition to studying the basic working of the endocannabinoid system, also is looking at how THC in cannabis can affect the functioning of the system in the brain, particularly at different stages of brain development, adolescent and later in life. And this work is supported by the National Institute of Drug Abuse.
Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you here to give us some information about the implications for research if cannabis were to be rescheduled. So now we're going to move on to the government and policy side. Ethan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this important conversation with everyone. My name is Ethan Fallon. I work as a counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. I support the portfolios of Senator Alex Padilla, and my areas of focus include criminal justice and civil rights. So this topic definitely covers sort of both those areas in different ways. And of course, like any good attorney, I have to give a little disclaimer that my thoughts and views are my own and not necessarily that of the government or any member of the Senate. But I'm happy to have this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really look forward to your insight on what might be happening on the political side around the movement towards rescheduling. Aaron, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. It's great to be here with you and with everybody. This is a very important topic. I am Aaron Smith, the CEO and co-founder of National Cannabis Industry Association. I've worked in the cannabis reform movement for around 20 years, but started NCIA as the industry's trade association back in 2010 to specifically address issues that affect the regulated cannabis industry, which is now operating in the vast majority of states, a very tightly regulated industry. We lobby Congress on their behalf and have been, advocating along with others for this rescheduling move. So look forward to the conversation today.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being here. Jordan, why don't we go to you next?
Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, everybody else and the attendees. My name is Jordan Tischler. I am a physician and a cannabinoid specialist. My practice is entirely focused on treating patients with various cannabinoids. I'm also instructor of medicine at Harvard University and the founder of the Association of Cannabinoid Specialists, which is an international not-for-profit that focuses on providing education to clinicians as well as to lawmakers with the idea that patients need better care than they're getting through the current regulations, and that we need a unified policy at the national level. That'll do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We really look forward to your perspective. And finally, someone I've also known for about 20 years, Steph Sherer, the Executive Director of Americans for Safe Access. Steph, would you give us a little introduction?
Yes. Hello, everyone. It's great to see everyone in one spot. My name is Steph Sherer, and I'm the founder and president of Americans for Safe Access. We bring all the different stakeholders within medical cannabis, from researchers, patients, medical professionals, and people who produce medical cannabis together and work on creating policies that work for patients. So we are bringing the patient view. We've been waiting for a moment of recognition of our medical use from our federal government for a very long time. So when I started Americans for Safe Access, there was 80% support nationwide for medical cannabis, and I was a very cocky 25-year-old that thought it would just take a couple years to figure all this out. And here we are 22 years later. You're still navigating, but obviously have learned a lot. And I think it's a very weird reality for patients, where on one hand, we've been working very closely and sort of carrying out this checklist to get to a point where we could reschedule cannabis at the federal level. And on the other side of that, no one's really talking about the fact that the reason we're rescheduling cannabis is because of its accepted medical use. And so, working closely with the FDA and HHS on the sort of parameters of how to look at currently accepted medical use in the United States, I'm really hoping to see, as Amanda said in the opening, this changes everything as far as these major conversations we're having and how to approach research and medicine, and maybe finally finding a way to integrate medical cannabis into our healthcare systems. But it doesn't do much for the current access programs. So it's almost two different conversations. But no matter how you're approaching this, rescheduling alone is not enough. So we hope people aren't just think that somebody else has got it covered, because there's still a lot to do.
Thank you so much, Steph. And I'm glad that you brought up kind of this recognition of accepted medical value, because that was really a huge block to all of the requests to revisit the Schedule I status for all of these decades. And it really took a head of Health and Human Services to say, we do have enough research now. We can open this up. We can review what we know and make a decision about whether or not cannabis belongs in Schedule I. And, that had always been the block for decades and decades, was we would petition to be reviewed. Health and Human Services would say, oh, there isn't enough research to even open it up and review. And so because of researchers like Daniele that have really been pushing to get this research accomplished, that's what's really opened up this conversation. And so I think that recognition of medical value is such an important cornerstone to why we're seeing movement at all. So we're going to jump into some questions. I am going to direct the questions at one of our panelists to start, but then I'm going to open it up to the rest of the panelists if they have any comments on this topic as well. And then again, we'll get to your questions. So if you have a question, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we will have time for that as we move towards the end of the webinar. So Ethan, I am going to start with you. This is a question I'm sure you get asked a lot. It's a question I get asked a lot. How might rescheduling cannabis to Schedule III impact federal and state laws that currently govern its use, especially in states where cannabis is legal for recreational or medicinal use?
Certainly. I think rescheduling cannabis could ease some of the conflicts between state and federal law, could provide some tax and business benefits, and importantly, promote medical research. Unfortunately, or however, it would not entirely legalize the drug for all uses under federal law. So a lot of the same legal complexities would remain the same. And this is especially true in areas where federal law is strictly enforced, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute. But while federal and state laws would still remain discordant to an extent, the impact of rescheduling would certainly transform the legal landscape. And so to begin with, the federal legal changes, I think there are four main areas that will be impacted, but are especially noteworthy. First, cannabis would be officially recognized as having accepted medical use. A co-panelist sort of just brought this up, and I think that's a very important thing to underscore because Schedule 1 drugs, as many of you know, are considered to have absolutely no medical use or value. So this would be a major shift in policy, but also just as a legal matter. And as has been mentioned, that's been a major impediment of prior attempts to reschedule the drug in the past. Second, there would be a reduction in criminal penalties. Criminal penalties for possession, distribution, and use would be reduced, aligning more with substances like anabolic steroids or ketamine, which are currently on Schedule 3. The impact rescheduling would have on our criminal justice system is pretty substantial, and I want to give a little more detail on that. So I'll turn back to that at the end to talk about it a little bit more. But the third bucket I wanted to mention is there will be some tax and financial benefits. Cannabis businesses would likely benefit from more favorable tax treatment under the IRS code, which currently disallows deductions for businesses trafficking in Schedule 1 or 2 substances. For example, rescheduling would allow businesses to take a certain type of deduction, which could improve their financial stability. Fourth, access to banking services and research opportunities would also likely improve. In this scenario, banks would be more likely to provide services to cannabis businesses, and research on the drug could expand because there will be fewer regulatory hurdles and less restrictive funding opportunities, which we often see with Schedule 1 drugs. It's really hard to get money to conduct the research that's needed. Now, when thinking about state laws, rescheduling might have less of a direct impact on state regulatory regimes, but we might still see some practical changes. For example, in states where cannabis is legal for recreational use, like in California or Colorado, we might not see much of a change, and states certainly wouldn't have to adjust their own laws because they retain authority to regulate cannabis independently. But closer alignment between state and federal policies could reduce sort of those legal conflicts and tensions that often arise, and it would make interstate commerce a little easier, I suspect, in terms of transportation and just overall access. Similarly, states that have legalized cannabis for medical purposes would also experience some more consistency between state and federal regulations. And I think the consequence of that would be that medical marijuana patients and providers would have greater legal certainty and less risk of federal prosecution in that scenario. I think rescheduling would also lead to fewer federal law enforcement actions against cannabis businesses and users that are in compliance with already existing state laws. So in turn, we could see sentencing for cannabis-related offenses lowered and lead to the review or expungement of certain convictions related to the drug, if that changes. Notwithstanding the impact rescheduling would have on federal and state laws, I think there would still be some areas of continued conflict or ambiguity. Currently, federal authorities handle state marijuana laws that conflict with federal law by prioritizing enforcement based on certain factors, such as preventing distribution to minors, stopping revenue streams from cannabis sales that fund criminal enterprises, preventing diversion to states where it is still illegal, addressing public health and safety risks. And so, the Department of Justice has, in fact, issued guidance to federal prosecutors to deprioritize enforcement in states with robust regulatory systems. So states like California and Colorado, which have a very robust regulations over the drug, would likely continue to see less federal involvement. So while Schedule 3 status would lower the level of regulations, cannabis would still be a controlled substance. And so federal agencies like the DEA would continue to enforce laws regarding its production, distribution, and use. It'll just depend on sort of how the agencies are prioritizing federal law. And the other area that I sort of wanted to highlight is employment and housing. Many existing federal policies that govern federal employees or federal housing, including drug testing and things like that, might still consider cannabis use problematic. And regardless of its status under state law or even rescheduling, could still be an issue. So we might not see much change in those policies, but perhaps those would be relaxed as well and would be an independent sort of factor. Now, turning back to the topic of criminal justice, I'd like to be a little more explicit on the impact rescheduling would have, because I think it's pretty important. To put it simply, rescheduling would reduce penalties under several federal criminal statutes and regulations by changing how offenses involving cannabis are categorized and punished. Under the Controlled Substances Act, Schedule I drugs, like cannabis currently, carry the harshest penalties. For example, simple possession can result in up to a year in prison for a first-time offense. Moving to Schedule III would reduce these penalties because possession of Schedule III drugs is generally considered a misdemeanor with a lot lower fines and shorter potential jail times. Second, the federal sentencing guidelines also use drug schedules to determine the severity of sentences and the base offense levels for crimes involving production, distribution, possession, and so those would be lowered with the shift to Schedule 3. Third, there would also be an impact on collateral consequences or the non-criminal repercussions for convictions. Today, individuals convicted of offenses involving Schedule 1 or 2 drugs face strict collateral consequences, such as restrictions on receiving federal benefits, student loans, professional licenses. And so reclassification would reduce or eliminate many of these consequences, and it really has the potential to drastically change the trajectory of someone's life following a conviction. Lastly, just to mention mandatory minimum sentences. Current laws impose mandatory minimum sentences for certain cannabis offenses, particularly those involving large amounts or distribution near institutions, for example. And so by rescheduling to Schedule 3, these mandatory minimums could be lowered or entirely removed because the penalties for Schedule 3 substances are less severe than Schedule 1s, as I mentioned. So in other words, this would allow sentencing judges more leeway in how to appropriately mete out consequences and justice for cannabis-related offenses. Whereas currently, oftentimes judges are dictated on sentencing based on these guidelines or minimums. So ultimately, these changes would make federal penalties for cannabis offenses more aligned with those for drugs like steroids or ketamine, which are currently on Schedule 3. So.
Oh, that was fantastic. I know that you probably answered a lot of questions that people have had about what the impact of rescheduling is on the criminal justice piece of this. A lot of folks, even if they don't support cannabis use, they don't support criminal penalties for people who use cannabis. And so understanding not only the opportunity to lower criminal penalties, but to eliminate some of the collateral sanctions associated with having a drug charge, which, as you know, can follow somebody even after they've already served their time, I think is really great to hear. And, understanding that this does change things at the federal level and may open up some opportunities for it to be easier for companies to operate in that space. Before we move on to the next question, I want to see if any of our other panelists have any comments.
As far as the federal component goes?
Yeah, and in terms of what could possibly happen to federal and state laws if cannabis is rescheduled, or any thoughts you may have on what Ethan said.
Well, I think that one of the major differences we see, and this is probably sort of a bridge to some of the other conversations we're going to have, is that under Schedule I substances, they're really only regulated by DEA and the Department of Justice, right? So because they're not distributed, or there's FDA isn't involved, these other agencies aren't involved with their manufacturing or distribution, except for limited research. But as soon as it moves into Schedule II or III, then it actually becomes subject to all these other agencies that actually the current state programs haven't dealt with yet, right? They haven't dealt with what it means to have FDA involved in this. So, and then I really want to echo what Ethan said, is that there is, there's a lot of opportunities that this opens up, and legally for patients, the term accepted medical use actually is brought up in a lot of different legal cases about patients' rights and protections. So I think that, going back to what Amanda said, this kind of starts, it's like a new chapter. And if you're not familiar with the old chapter, that didn't just include bringing up these businesses. It included battles at the city level. It included lawsuits that went, up to state courts, went all the way up to the Supreme Court. So I think with this new set, really, it means we're looking at all legal cases again, all of these regulatory pieces that really are going to have to be rewritten.
Thank you, Steph. Any other comments on kind of the impact to state and federal law as a result of scheduling?
I think
Jordan?
I might add, I think that Ethan did a wonderful job of summarizing the pros and cons. I'm concerned that perhaps things will not be quite as rosy. I mean, I think he presented a lot of what might happen. Even if we get Schedule III, it's not going to resolve the conflict between the federal government and the state's government. And there's going to be a lot of work to figure out how to harmonize that. And the fact that it's on Schedule III doesn't mean, or will never mean, that it is legally okay for the states to have done what they've done as a matter of national policy. So I think that there's a lot of work there to be done. And he sort of didn't mention the Coleman Memorandum, but that's sort of the basis of this prioritization. And the federal government can, of course, change their priorities at any moment, so that and the point being that being on Schedule III would certainly leave them ample leverage to go after state legal programs should they choose to do so. So that in many ways, my concern is that this is meaningful to some degree, but largely symbolic beyond that. Symbolism should not be written off. I think is very important, but there is, to Steph's earlier point, a lot of conversation that needs to happen subsequent to this that won't necessarily happen unless we keep pushing for it.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And I mean, states have been living in this reality ever since California decided to start allowing exceptions to the law in 1996 for medical use. And we've seen an ebb and flow in allowance, right? We've seen times when DAs have come in and shut down longstanding dispensaries after a period of tolerance. We've seen, symbolic or, memos coming out of the executive branch that people would bring to meetings and say, hey, I have this memo. Does that mean I can do what I'm doing? And so I think, those of us who have been in the industry a long time, have been in the space a long time, are very used to that ambiguity. And, it really, like you said, it does kind of depend on what is the whim of those in charge and how far do they want to go to crack down on programs that are now bringing in billions of dollars of tax revenue, which I think also changed the conversation. And Aaron will definitely get to that point when we get to you. But I'd like to move on to talk a little bit about research. So Daniele, your department has been doing amazing research, really helping us understand the mechanisms of action by which cannabis is a therapy. And to remind folks out there that may think we've known about the endocannabinoid system for 100 years, we really just discovered that this system existed in the 1990s. So there's still so much research that needs to be done to better understand how phytocannabinoids interact with our endocannabinoid system and how cannabis may be working. We don't even really know how aspirin works. So how cannabis may be working on our bodies in order to provide this kind of therapeutic effect. at the same time, trying to research a Schedule I drug and the potential medical value of a Schedule I drug, which by definition has no medical value, is very, very difficult. And NIDA has had a long-standing, kind of history of funding research that looks at harms and addiction of scheduled substances rather than potential benefits of scheduled substances. And with that, all of the grant funding that they administer underneath them. So I want to ask you, what new opportunities for research might arise from cannabis being rescheduled to Schedule III, particularly in areas that were previously underexplored due to legal constraints?
Well, thank you, Amanda. That's a really good question. So to answer it, let me just share with you, first of all, with the viewers, what it takes to do an experiment with cannabis or THC. They're not the same thing, right? THC is the pure compound. Cannabis would be the plant. So here's what it happens. So as a basic scientist, so a scientist working with animals, typically, you need to have a Schedule I license, which you need to maintain. And it is actually a burden, a substantial administrative burden to do that, especially if you are like me, in your office. I don't have assistants. I don't have, a big department that I can leverage, and it's costly. So there is that. And if you're a clinical researcher, you have to do exactly the same thing, right? But once you have done that, it's only one step. I sometimes bring people in and I show them, let me show you where I have THC. So I take them to the lab, I take them to this freezer that is locked. I open the locked freezer. There is inside the freezer that is locked. This is locked safe. I open the safe, and inside this safe, there is a tiny little vial with 10 milligrams of THC. And then I tell them, you can go 5 miles from here at any dispensary, and you can get yourself 10 grams of the very same substance and walk it home, and nothing happens. So the point that I want to make with this is not just the burden in terms of the cost of having to put together all this safety accoutrements, but the fact that it only affects research. It does not affect actually usage by the public. The public can use it. Even if it's illegal, we know that the public can use it. So the problem, in my mind, after 30 years doing this, is that I think this legal landscape is not really designed to keep safe the public. It's really intentionally designed, to reduce research in this area. And this I find scandalous. These are really, really something that really completely irritates me. But aside from that, if I am a clinical researcher, which thank God I'm not, the path is even worse, because now, in addition to, of course, working with the DEA, you have to work with the FDA, and that's natural. You need to do that. But now think about this. You're writing a grant that takes maybe 2 years to get. Then once you have the money, you have to have your DEA license lined up with that. You have to have your FDA approval lined up with that. And in California, you also have this additional layer of complexity called the RAPC, the Research Advisory Panel of California, on which I am a member, by the way. And that additional piece of bureaucracy makes a project that could be done in a year, a 4 to 5 year project. So this is enough to discourage almost anyone from doing anything with THC or with cannabis, and it does. So from my standpoint, although I agree with both Ethan and Steph and Jordan that there are opportunities and there are problems, from my standpoint, the fact that the possibility, it's not a fact yet, the possibility of a descheduling to Schedule III would have an enormous psychological impact for us basic science researchers who have IACUC approval, animal proposal approval, but not human approval. It means that we can get cannabis and THC from our pharmacy. And we don't have to go through all these hoops to get THC or cannabis. So that is itself, I think, psychologically a huge change. assuming, of course, the devil is in the details, that no new roadblocks are introduced by the goodwill of our lawmakers, who, for example, in the very text that Ethan was referring to, say, yeah, cannabis is now going to go to Schedule 3, but synthetic cannabinoids are remaining in Schedule 1. Synthetic THC is remaining in Schedule 1. So those of us who work with THC don't know if they now are Schedule 3 or Schedule 1. And I want to just, we are all UC system here. I mean, some of us are UC system here, certainly organized by Berkeley. At UC system, in the Office of the President, I can tell you that no lawyer will accept that this is a Schedule 3 if there is a possibility that it's a Schedule 1. It's just a question of being risk averse, as any good lawyer has to be. So the point I'm trying to make is that there is a psychological barrier there, presumably it's going to go down, assuming that this will pass, and there will be great news, provided that there are no hidden bombs, there are no hidden traps, like the one I just mentioned, synthetic cannabinoids, and provided, of course, that we can get the state and the federal government to agree on things. Now, there are two additional points I wanted to make briefly. One is I also feel that in addition to us researchers, a change in schedule could facilitate resolving a problem, could help resolving a problem that is very close to my heart, and is the difference between cannabis use as a medicine and cannabis use as a non-medicine. And I don't like the term recreational, but I think that we all agree on what it means, so I'll use it colloquially. Cannabis use as a medicine has certain specificity. So the amount, the quantity, and Jordan can, and Steph can correct me if they think I'm wrong, but in my understanding of the clinical studies, the type of cannabis that is used by real patients tends not to be as strong in terms of THC content than as the cannabis that we can buy today in a dispensary. So that there is a little bit of a discrepancy there. So in addition of the quote unquote strength, so the amount of THC, the other thing is that a patient who goes to a dispensary because they found in March a particular type of cannabis that was good for them, when they go back in July, it may not be on the shelves anymore. So what we have is a situation where I think scheduling down to Schedule 3 may help resolving some of these things for the people who are using it, with the assistance of a physician, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one point I wanted to make. The other point, and then I'm finished, is about NIDA. So we like as scientists to, of course, to everyone, the public, to say, okay, the federal government, NIDA, they're doing their job, guys. They're just doing their job. It's in the title, NIDA. So they don't do treatment. And, I'll tell you, I speak to them all the time. I receive most of my funding from them. So, of course, I'm biased for this reason, but I'm also very cognizant of what kind of folks they are. They would like to do it. They can do it. It's not their mandate. If you want to get this stuff done, you have to go to the new NCCIH, which is this Institute for Complementary Medicine, and they have a much lower budget. So that opens a different question, right? So maybe we should get more money to that institute to do the type of research that is needed. I'll stop there.
Well, thank you so much for that. And it reminds me of over a decade ago at the International Cannabis Research Symposium, I was talking to the then deputy director of NIDA about this issue. And he basically echoed the same thing that you're saying. Our directive is to fund research that looks at the potential harms and the addiction of illicit substances. And it's not in our mandate to fund research that's looking at their potential benefits. And so that has been an issue. We came at this as very one-sided for a very long time. And just now are we starting to see funding come through NIH and other agencies looking at medical use of cannabis. So I agree with you that there is a psychological component to this that will hopefully end up working its way through the governing bodies and the legal bodies to understand what needs to be done in order to facilitate people being able to use cannabis medicinally in a way that's effective and efficient for them. So I want to open it up to see if anybody has any other comments about research.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that you know, the change in schedule, it really opens up this other issue with cannabis, right? That the criminal justice component is one issue that faces, that stops the progress of cannabis medicines, and makes it hard to research. But the other is that there is not currently a framework that works for plant-based medicines in this way, and so trying to put cannabis, if you just take the legal part out and trying to put cannabis into any of the existing frameworks at the FDA, we're going to have that challenge. So even though it is Schedule 3, which is, I think, also why people are having a lot of issues with it, there's not a product that's going to go into pharmacies the day it's rescheduled, right? Like those products are still going to have to go through FDA approval. And so part of, what we see this and what we were really hoping rescheduling meant to any level was, okay, let's talk about the system itself. Like, how do we get this complex, amazing plant into a form that can actually look like medicine, where you start connecting the work that researchers are doing with the education that doctors are having, with the experiences that patients are having, with what's actually on the shelf, right? And so right now we're all completely siloed. And in fact, we don't even have the same language. So I think that's going to be the next opportunity, hopefully, right? I think there's a lot of people that just, let's face it, and dealing with an intoxicant in a society is much easier than redefining medicine.
Yeah, great point, Steph. So we're going to shift gears for just a minute before we go back to medical use. But I want to remind folks out there, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A, not in the chat, because there's a lot of noise going on in the chat and it's hard to figure out where the questions are. So we are going to have time for some panelist questions at the end. So please throw those in the Q&A. Feel free to make comments in the chat, but if you want your question to be answered or considered, please put that in the Q&A. So Erin, you've been awfully quiet over there. So before we kind of circle back on medical use and acceptance, I want to talk a bit about the industry. The cannabis industry now has grown quite a bit, especially just in the last decade. We're starting to see real impacts, both on, tax revenue and local programs, but also on real businesses maturing and going into multiple states. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of states that house a number of very, very small businesses. Here where I live in Washington, we have just thousands of tiny brands on the shelves and dispensaries. So I want to ask you, from an industry perspective, how might rescheduling affect the growth of the legal regulated cannabis industry, and specifically small businesses? Is this going to make it harder for them? Is this going to make it easier? Kind of what's your take on the impacts of this for the industry?
Yeah, thank you. So, I kind of take a step back and see where the state of the industry is now. Despite the fact the federal government has not acknowledged medical value, and we've been in the Schedule 1 paradigm for all of these years, we have now 24 states that have authorized the regulated production and sale of cannabis for adults over 21. Another 14 that have some form of medical cannabis industry where it's regulated and dispensed through dispensaries. So we have about 3/4 of Americans live in a state that has departed from federal law on this. Just over half live in a state that allows adult use. And I do not want to diminish the absolute importance and the historical step forward that rescheduling would be, but and has been said already, is that the state-based industry will continue to be out of compliance with federal law. We will be trafficking Schedule 3 drugs out of compliance with federal law versus Schedule 1, and that's it was mentioned that's drugs like anabolic steroids and ketamine. So I think that in many ways, this industry will continue to be a state-based industry until we have broader federal reform. And I'm fairly bearish on what the effects of rescheduling will be on things like banking, insurance, while I think it will kind of change the culture a little bit. And as more banks have been taking industry accounts and providing lending to the industry over the years anyway, as more states have come online and just the general culture has changed around cannabis and the risk tolerance has decreased. But it actually doesn't change the statutes around banking. It doesn't change the legal status. Banks will still be taking a risk. But one really big, positive, exciting area is in the tax code. So there's a little known provision of the tax code, section 280E, which states that if you're trafficking in a controlled substance, a Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 controlled substance, you cannot take business deductions associated with that activity. This was passed in the 1980s to prevent cocaine dealers from writing off the cost of their speedboats, I guess, and that sort of thing. But when in practice today, it's really only applied to legal cannabis providers, because these are the only operators that are trafficking illegally in federally illegally controlled substances that are actually filing taxes and declaring this because they have a state license on their wall. So this has resulted in many businesses not being profitable. Last I saw, somewhere 27%, only 27% of cannabis businesses reported profitability last year. And that's because as a result of 280E, they're effectively paying taxes on their gross receipts almost they're looking at, instead of somewhere around 20-25% effective tax rate, somewhere between 60 and 75%, depending on how they structure their business. So this will have an immediate positive impact. Rescheduling, as long as we go to 3, not to 2, but if we go to 3 or higher or lower, however you want to look at that, then this would have an immediate positive impact. Something like $2 billion a year is being overpaid in federal taxes by the industry. That will go back into the industry, which will allow reinvestment in businesses, allow these businesses to be profitable, allow prices to drop, which I think will have great impact for consumers and for patients. And from an investment standpoint, I mean, that can only be positive. You've seen the public markets, which isn't really that's one barometer. It's not everything, but public markets have certainly reacted positively to rescheduling news. And then you saw when the DEA scheduled a hearing and stated that this was going to drag the process on a little bit longer, the public markets in cannabis plunged by something like 10 or 15%. So there's certainly, I think, going to be a big paradigm shift when 280E is in the rearview mirror. But there will be a lot more to do after that. The industry will, as Steph mentioned, there is no federal classification for plant-based whole plant medicine, and that for these businesses to actually become compliant with federal law after Schedule 3, they would have to go through $1 billion new drug approval process. And again, they're likely you're not going to see whole plant cannabis products approved by the FDA anyway. So it really leaves this still in the hands of the states until we get a broader reform.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I think it's really important that we do look at this from the industry side as well as the patient and consumer side, because the industry supports access to products for people who need them. And so they have to be able to do what they need to do to stay compliant with state laws, also to grow and to have the products that are needed by people for both medical and adult use purposes. So I do want to circle back to medical use, because I think, one of the themes that's come out of this talk is that, yes, we're talking about the opportunity for the lowering of criminal penalties, for the removal of collateral sanctions, for there to be some movement at the federal level in terms of how cannabis is viewed and the punishments that are doled out as a result of possession and possibly sales. We've talked about the tax implications for the industry, but we really started this conversation by saying a huge cornerstone of rescheduling is the recognition of medical value of cannabis. And even though cannabis has been used as a medicine across the globe for thousands of years, it hasn't had recognized medical value in the US in quite some time. Despite that, thousands, millions, a whole bunch of people are using cannabis to meet their healthcare needs every day, but thousands more are not doing that because cannabis is classified as the most dangerous type of substance, and they have fears around what that means. So Jordan, I want to take this next question to you. how could rescheduling impact perceptions and stigmas associated with medical cannabis use? And do you think this would open up possibilities for more people to try medical cannabis, and maybe just as importantly, for more doctors to be open to their patients using medical cannabis?
Thank you. I think it's an interesting question, and I've spent a lot of time pondering this. And quite frankly, I think the answer is it's probably going to have much less impact than we'd like. Because while certainly Schedule 3 is less stigmatized, has lesser punishments associated with it, state legal cannabis, which is really the only cannabis we're really talking about, will never be in compliance. And furthermore, we have to recognize that all of the drugs that are on any of the schedules, save one, are FDA-approved medications, and cannabis as a botanical is never going to achieve that, simply because it's not consistent enough to make it through the FDA process. So I think that we're really looking at a much longer process wherein Schedule 3 encourages the research that Daniele was talking about, and then we're going to progress to more conventional appearing pharmaceuticals that will in fact get through the FDA. And there's a lot of very interesting movement in that direction already without having the rescheduling. So I can see that the rescheduling will help that. But in terms of the stigma, maybe, there will be some positive outcome in terms of people reconsidering it, simply because there's so much national discussion around this. And I think that's a positive. In terms of my colleagues, I think that most of my colleagues are sort of vaguely pro medical cannabis, but most of them are not versed enough in it to do it, in that the systems that we have at the moment look so different from what we're used to with federal prescribing, that it isn't something that they can willingly take on and make heads or tails of now. And I don't think that rescheduling really is going to change the practicality of that. It may sort of gently prod more of them to sort of think positively about it. But I think that ultimately, one of the major issues that faces both the patients and their providers is that the current systems are so non-prescriptive that, in fact, we see a whole range of negative outcomes for patients in terms of both delay to their care, as well as the development and the increasing incidence of cannabis use disorder, which, despite what people may want to think, is in fact a real thing. I think that we need to move in the direction of something where we can provide patients with what they need better than what we can at the moment. And I don't see that Schedule 3 achieves that, although it certainly starts to pave the way in the right direction.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I do think that, there is, I really agree with what you said, that doctors might not be against it, but they don't have the education and the background to feel like they can be proficient enough to take on that role of being the care provider around cannabis for their patients.
It's also a time thing. I mean, you think about the average appointment with a primary care provider, right? And they've got like 10 minutes with you. I, on the other hand, spend an hour with my patients at the first meeting, and I'm not worrying about seat belts and pap smears and mammograms, right? So I think that in some ways, the current concept that primary care folks are just kind of, once the stigma is gone, get on board here, just isn't really pragmatic. And ultimately, meaning 20, 30 years from now, when this is sort of all under our belt and is sort of just part of the normal routine medicine, sure, then that may be more valid, but we're not there yet. And furthermore, the systems by which we provide that kind of access don't fit in the sort of normal day-to-day activities of these providers. So you're really asking them not only to take on a whole new area of knowledge, but also a whole new practical approach to practicing every day when they still only got 10 minutes to do it all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I saw my primary care yesterday. I think it was 3 minutes.
Wonderful.
So I have one more question that I'm going to address here to Steph, and then I have a question for everyone, but I'm going to ask you to give me a very short 1 to 2 sentence answer for. But we do have some questions in the Q&A, which we will then get to. If any of you want, the panelists, Ethan, I see you've been doing this, and thank you very much. Feel free to go through those questions, and if there's one that you think you can answer, feel free to answer it in the Q&A, so we can make sure that everybody's question gets addressed. So feel free to check that out and answer anything that you feel is pertinent to your background and your knowledge. So Steph, I want to go to you last but certainly not least with this set of questions. So Jordan talked about kind of the stigma associated with people seeking out medical cannabis or thinking that medical cannabis may be an option for them. We know that there are a lot of people out there that already do think it's an option for them, that already are using it as an option for them. We also know that in many places, it is extremely expensive. As it was already mentioned, it's hard to go back and get the same product again and again. And people may find themselves driving all over just to find a tincture that works for them and finding a tincture at all. In New Frontier, we do a consumer survey, and we find that even people that live in legal markets doesn't mean they have access to all legal products. So I want to ask you, if cannabis is rescheduled to Schedule 3, what do you think will be the impact on the current medical cannabis programs across various states, particularly regarding accessibility and affordability of medical cannabis for patients?
I think it will have no impact.
All right, next question.
I mean, I think that, you know, again, even I know you keep saying like, it's not just the taxation, that's the conversation about the industry, right? And actually everything that we've talked about is actually about the production and manufacturing of cannabis. We haven't, like, really, whether you're talking about, a doctor, one of the reasons doctors, don't want to engage, it's not necessarily because they're old school or they're just afraid of litigious Americans. But the reality is there's not one fact as a patient that you can hold on to make any decision. And what I mean by that is your doctor can tell you all about cannabinoids, right? You can read, the latest research paper, but taking that information and trying to find that you can't, right? Everything is experimentation. And so, I don't think that, within the current framework, we're going to see much of a change. I think where we will see a change is maybe, in conversations that people have with their negative grandma, or right, or maybe having an employer like explain, like, look, like, this isn't just me, I'm validated by the federal government, they just haven't figured this out. Maybe with a landlord, maybe with assisted living or in hospice. And again, these are all, like it's always been, just exemptions to an existing framework. I think that the conversations, though, that we can have finally, in the same way that one of the things this may sound like a double negative, but one of the positives that have come out as far as the adult use market being parallel with the medical cannabis is that it's no longer a question mark of whether or not legalizing cannabis will benefit patients, right? The answer is it maybe helped with more access, but it doesn't actually solve all of our problems. And the adult use market, that's not what they're there for. That's not what they want to do. And unfortunately, because of the geofenced business, the markets that they have to work in, of course, when you're faced with paying payroll and a state passes a law that says that you can sell cannabis to anyone, of course you're going to get that extra license I mean, it's stressful, running any business. But what that ultimately means, no matter what your intentions were when you started, down that path of getting that additional license, the reality is customers coming in the door, right? And there's only so much shelf space. And so when patients have to compete with adult use consumers, we don't see what we need on the shelves, right? And it doesn't address all of these other issues that we've seen. So I think that something that isn't helpful are all these sort of either or, black or white conversations. Like, you can be for a medical cannabis marketplace that moves forward on a different trajectory than where adult use goes, and not hate each other, right? I think that what is hard for patients right now is that we feel like a lot of people are speaking on our behalf, right? A lot of people are saying, oh, adult use is taking care of medical, let's just legalize it for everyone. And so we're not seeing, so we're having this experience where we go talk to our doctors and they're like, yeah, wait till it's FDA approved. And we're like, it's never going to be FDA approved. And then we go to, we see in the press that businesses are saying that they're representing us, and we're not seeing that. So I think that in the same way that a lot of myths have been disproved, I think that by moving cannabis into Schedule 3, I think a very harmful myth will also be disproved, which is big pharma taking care of this, right? Like that for some reason people think that pharma was waiting for it to be rescheduled to get involved, when in fact pharma has been involved, and they've proven that going down the existing pathway, it's not profitable, right? Pharmaceutical companies aren't interested in making a profit. They're interested in making an obscene profit. And cannabis medicines are essentially generics. And if you look at the pharmaceutical companies in this country, they actually step out when generics are involved. So we're seeing a lot of stuff happening. It's exciting in the sort of biotech world. But if we look at the way that works in the United States, biotech just develops until they get bought out by a pharmaceutical company for the distribution and that next level. So I think that, again, we've got to really look at how we approach medicine to make this mean something. So what I'm hoping is that, the conversations that I've had for years with people that, again, and even with people within the cannabis space that we've been working for 22 years to hopefully open up this pathway, that now tell me that, the current cannabis market isn't going to develop medicines and we should ask pharma to do it. It's a little frustrating, but I think that, we finally can have these conversations. But again, it means, it means opening up to a new conversation on every side, right? So you'll see that patients get really defensive when someone is saying anything about medical cannabis, right? Any sort of harms. And not speaking about harms is harmful, right? Not talking about the issues is harmful. And I think prohibition has cast the sort of all debates around cannabis in either black or white, right? It's either legal or not legal. But like, you can't even, like, the word cannabis isn't even one thing, right? Like, it's like asking, someone will ask for a definition of snow, right? If you look at cannabis, it means something different to a lot of people. So I think in the day-to-day, nothing is going to happen except for, and this is really an important part of this, that this becomes an opportunity for anyone who would like to see cannabis as a part of the healthcare infrastructure. And I'm not saying try to shove it in somewhere we don't like. I'm saying this is an opportunity to change what we don't like, right? In countries where there is national health care, the countries are helping pay for research. They want more people taking cannabis, but they have a lot of different infrastructural components we don't have. We don't have compounding pharmacies on every corner, right? Doctors can't write a lot of doctors don't know how to write compounding prescriptions. And so in an environment where like in the United States in healthcare, where we're so dependent on pharmaceutical companies, even for doctor education, how are we going to do this without them, right? And specifically about medicine. And so how are we going to approach that? And the answer is use this opportunity to not feel like a criminal. Take off your defensive suit about whether or not cannabis has medical value. Right? Take that off, stop being defensive. And no matter what happens with the DEA, our top health agencies have said that there's accepted medical use. So keep that suit on no matter what happens with DEA, and start advocating from that point of view. And so the conversation, again, with your federal policymakers is, this is an accepted medical use. It can't go through the FDA. Let's create a program that's going to allow that to happen.
Thank you, Steph. Very, very much appreciated you bringing this perspective. I know that you've seen this evolution happen across multiple states over multiple years. So I do want to get to some audience questions, and then I'll end with the quick fire going around. But there's been a couple questions in the Q&A around something that was brought up by you, Steph, and some others, which is the role of the FDA. If cannabis is deemed to have medical value, if it's rescheduled to Schedule III, a lot of people have been asking, does this mean that dispensaries have to get an FDA license? Does this mean that they can only sell products that have been approved by the FDA? Does this mean that having a medical cannabis license and using the word medical means something in the eyes of the FDA about what you're selling? So Ethan, I'm going to start with you because I think this is a good lawyer question. Sorry, you're just drinking. But what are kind of the legal implications for people that are providing medical cannabis? And is there going to be some requirement that the FDA be involved in that?
So I think if we're staying in federal law land, how other drugs are treated on the same schedule, I think is, sort of what will be followed. So if you want something to be legal under the federal regime, you're going to have to go through the typical FDA sort of process to be able to do that. Now, if, first under state law, I think that remains the same, sort of what's already been happening. But yeah, I think it could be a long, arduous process to get there on the federal side.
Yeah, I can, and I think specifically, I mean, I think, and this is a fear we're hearing from a lot of people, is that the entire system of access, whether you're talking about adult use or medical, it's important to remember we created this completely outside of the Controlled Substance Act. So 1, 2, or 3, 4, like it's still, all of that operates outside of that. If it is Schedule III, the what's happening at the state level is not, it's still going to be outside of a legal Schedule III product. If you look at the Department of Justice, their findings, one of the first thing they say is that Schedule III laws will apply. And that means that anything that's outside of a FDA process, which means approved drug, is still illegal. So every business stays illegal. Nothing, like literally nothing changes when cannabis is rescheduled. And I think one of what FDA's role will be is again a big question mark. And I have a lot of ideas, but I think one of the whether you're talking about medical or adult use that people should be worried about is that how FDA plays in non-FDA approved drug processes. So I hear a lot of people talking about cannabis being regulated under ATF, under the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but I don't think people know that tobacco is actually also regulated under the FDA, thanks to your Senator Dianne Feinstein in California. But so FDA's role, I think may enhance as far as what people are saying about these products. But as far as needing a prescription or cannabis being in pharmacies, like that system, until we actually change something at the federal level, will be completely outside of that, the legality as well as access points.
Thank you, Steph.
I wanted just to add, we get a lot of kind of fears from folks out there and questions around, is FDA now going to step into those state programs and start, closing down state businesses because they're not complying with federal law? And I just, that is a possibility, but I would want to just kind of add that I think as a practical matter, it's a very remote possibility, and that we need to remember that this is a political process that started from the president of the United States pushing to relax cannabis laws, and Schedule III is about as far as it was able to go. Regardless of what happens in the next election, we're likely to see a continued laissez-faire sort of attitude on behalf of the federal government at worst. So I do want to make sure that there isn't too much fear around whether the FDA is going to step in and start changing things in the states. That said, we're advocating, and others, just about everybody's advocating for some clear guardrails and guidance from DOJ and FDA on how state operators can continue to operate.
Thank you for that, Aaron. So this next question, I just want to preface by saying I'm asking it because it got the most upvotes and not because it was asked by my dad. So Aaron, I'm going to direct this to you first and then Ethan. So is there any concern that rescheduling will remove any urgency that may exist today to consider and pass legislation to legalize or decriminalize cannabis under state and federal laws? So is that, there's been a lot of talk, a lot of push. We got to get banking. We got to get these, these laws changed. But now if we get this, this movement, Aaron, from the NCIA point of view, is there concern that this will kind of take the wind out of some of those sails and we won't see as much urgency? And then Ethan, is there anything that you can add from the perspective of being in the political environment? Aaron, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I can't say that I'm super concerned about that, but I also say that, it has crossed our minds that, there's a ton of priorities in front of Congress right now, and there are folks in elected positions that would like to just say, okay, well, this issue's done. So it's incumbent upon us to make sure we're having these conversations and continuing to make sure that they understand, our allies understand that this is not the end of the road. This is the beginning of the process. And I've been encouraged in conversations with our allies in Congress and in hearing, public statements being made that is getting through, that this is understood, that rescheduling is not the end of the road. And I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of use it as momentum to get to the next thing, which, in our mind is descheduling. But it's kind of just also a matter of what's politically possible, and perfect was not possible this year, right? Or in this, the last several years. And so this is about as big of a breakthrough as we could have expected, and that's why we're celebrating it as a win.
Thank you. Ethan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I, just from my observations and conversations that I've had with stakeholders and members of the public, this is an issue that we get. I hear a lot of commentary on, and I have for a long time. I don't think I fear that this will stop forward momentum. I actually think of it as the other way around, where this makes things easier to have conversations, to negotiate, to be able to point to the drug as being on Schedule 3, not Schedule 1. It's much easier, I think, to make the argument that something on a lower schedule can be safe, can be effective for medical use, and can be a little more hands-off perhaps on the restrictions. And so that's sort of how I view it, as sort of a stepping stone to other things.
Okay, thanks. Anyone else have a comment on that?
One more thing, which is I hope that is true. And every time we have a breakthrough, there is an opportunity, but it's really up to people keeping that pressure on, right? Like, if there are not people talking to a Senate office about cannabis, I'm guessing there's a lot of really important things that they'll be looking at. And we have an example of this when Obama became president and put out the Cole memo stopping the raids. Actually, Congress was like, okay, great. We don't need to do anything. And it actually took us 3 years to get the CJS amendment to actually, introduced. Like, Congress was seriously like, oh, it looks like Obama took care of it for you. So, a stepping stone is only a stepping stone if you step on it. So use this as a platform to move forward.
And I've looked at the attendee list. There are a lot of activists and people that come from cannabis activism out there. You know who you are. This is not a time to lay down and be silent. This is a time to ramp up those calls to your legislator, to your elected officials, and make sure they know that this isn't what we're not just going to go away once we get this, that this is going to be the beginning of us ramping up pressure to continue forward. So this next question, I think, Ethan, is probably best directed to you. We had talked about some federal agencies that may be involved once cannabis is rescheduled, including the FDA. Of course, the DEA is going to stay involved. Daniele talked about NIDA and their involvement in research. One of the things we haven't talked about is environmental practices. And so there was a question about whether you feel, or whether anyone wants to answer, that the EPA might get involved with some of the issues we have around the very large amounts of cannabis waste, especially disposable batteries and other things that are now left mainly to the states to regulate. Do you see the EPA coming in and taking a stance in this at all?
So I think whenever the DEA sort of has at times come in for farm industry sort of related issues and substances. So, I'm not sure how much of an active role that they would take. It's certainly possible, but I think that will probably remain largely within state sort of regimes.
Okay. Anyone else have thoughts about cannabis waste and the regulation around that?
I would just say that I think that one of the things that, it not being a Schedule I substance and completely prohibited is that it may open up avenues for states to apply for other funding and actually for FDA so not new programs for cannabis waste specifically, but I think one of the things the goal of progress with cannabis is fitting it into our society and stop creating a separate whole line of things for the businesses and everyone else to operate in. So we know that EPA will definitely have more of an opportunity to be involved in pesticides, which has been a huge challenge state to state. So that will finally create an opening, for them to take a leadership role there. And there's all sorts of zero waste programs that states work with the EPA on that I believe cannabis can now be a part of.
Okay, thank you for that. So Daniele, I want to focus this next question towards you because it's something that several panelists have alluded to, which is the fact that there's very little confidence that we would be able to get cannabis as a botanical medicine through the FDA process. And of course, we look at the FDA requirement of one molecule, one action that is required in order to approve a medicine. From a research perspective, do you think that moving cannabis to Schedule III will open up more opportunities and interest from researchers in figuring out how to move cannabis through the FDA process as a botanical medicine?
Well, you need a crystal ball for that. But here is what my feelings. The first feeling is that the FDA is actually open to the possibility of botanical agents. And we know that from the Epidiolex example, where they allowed basically this pure chemical, but is extracted from a plant. It contains other components. And so that was, I think, a very important step forward that also indicates the openness of the FDA. But the FDA is not part of another world. They're not in Mars. They're part of a world where there is, cannabis is Schedule I drug. So if cannabis becomes Schedule III, the psychology within the FDA will also be affected by that. Maybe there would be an openness to consider now extracts. But now here is where I think really it becomes important, where the industry now becomes a very, very important factor. I think Steph or someone else pointed out that cannabis is many things. And cannabis is many things. Cannabis is really a chemical plant in the sense of industry, not in the sense of vegetable. It's really a plant that makes a whole bunch of different chemicals. And we are now tapping into the possibility that some of these chemicals have very important, very useful applications. This is irrespective of what cannabis of the 70s, 80s, and 80s did. This is new. These are new findings. Say cannabigerol, for example, cannabichromine, all these different components are being studied. They can be produced by the plant at a relatively low cost, and if it's done in appropriate ways, a cannabigerol-rich cultivar of cannabis that is 99% pure and goes through the FDA process, I don't see why it shouldn't be approved by the FDA. This is not $1 billion perspective. I've run compounds through phase 1 to phase 3, phase 2. With $10-15 million, you can get it done. $20 million, you can get it done. It depends on how ambitious you are. So this is something for the industry to consider. Do they really care about the medical patients? Do they feel that there is profit being made through that pathway? But also, do they feel that that's part of their call or their, if you want, moral obligation to do something for the patient? Because I do believe, and I want to go back to what Steph was saying before, that we do not, in the current landscape, we are not serving the patients. We are serving people who, want to go buy, a joint and smoke it in tranquility of their house, which is perfectly fine with me. But we're not serving the patient who has chronic pain or is, or the the friend or we all have who has just had colon cancer and wants to alleviate the side effects of chemotherapy and asks me, and this, believe me, happens every other day, asks me, what product should I get? I wish I could tell them, oh, this is the name of the product, because what, the cannabis industry has just gone through the expenditure of $25 million. They got $50 million. They got this approved, and it's a little bit more costly, but you can be assured that they will be always the same, and it will be always on the shelves when you need them. I think that's why I think the Schedule III opens this possibility, these possibilities. And it's a new problem, so we have to think. We finished with one problem, Schedule I. We have a different problem now, and just like that's what we do, right? We solve problems. That's what we do. And so let's try and focus on what we can do to solve that particular problem, which, in my opinion, is a much smaller problem than the one we had before.
Thank you for that. Jordan, you have a quick comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, in the cultural milieu that has gotten us here today, there's a lot of focus on the cannabis as a plant. And I think that Daniele's point of using the word plant in a different, I always say, I don't care if it comes from a plant or a plant in New Jersey, right? Ultimately, it's about chemistry, and what cannabis can do for us today in its botanical form is very important and wonderful. But I also see it as the great teacher, right? And what are we learning from this plant and about the chemistry of both the plant and the human organism that will lead us to develop more specific cannabinoid and possibly terpenoid-based pharmaceuticals. And you look just, Dedi Mary in Haifa just published something today in which, or 2 days ago, in which he found an anti-T cell acute leukemia treatment, albeit in this test tube, that involves 2 common cannabinoids and a third one we've never heard of before. But the combination of the 3 of them is what's effective against this tumor. So, and presumably at levels that are not just represented in, oh, you just need to get OG Kush, right? So we're going to learn a lot here, and moving to Schedule III is going to facilitate that and facilitate our ability to get the FDA to look at these multi-compound medications that may not be botanical, but we learned from the botanical, and now we can move into this slightly more scientific approach.
Well, thank you for that reminder about how much of an infancy cannabis research really is in. We've spent a lot of time studying whether or not it lowers the IQ of adolescents, but now we may have the opportunity to study these very interesting novel cannabinoids that we're still just discovering and different ways in which they may affect diseases. And I'm with you. I feel like if putting cannabis in a form and in a delivery system that makes people feel more comfortable with it and brings them a more standardized, reliable dose will get more people to use that instead of opiates, instead of these other medications. I'm for it. And I hope that Schedule III or descheduling, rescheduling, wherever we land, will open up that opportunity. So I said I was going to have a rapid fire question before Michael closes us out. And I'm only going to let you answer this in like 2 words. So get ready, because that's not going to be easy for this group. So Schedule III is what we've been talking about. But if you could wave your wand and have cannabis end up anywhere, where would that be? And I don't want a long explanation. I just want like 2 words: schedule, deschedule, which schedule. So Ethan, I'm going to start with you.
Personally, deschedule.
Deschedule. Aaron? You're on mute.
Descheduled and regulated.
Daniele?
Descheduled and regulated.
Jordan?
Descheduled and controlled by the FDA.
Right.
Steph?
I would say, I don't believe in magic wands. And so I would say not criminalized, but under Schedule VI. A new schedule, a new pathway.
Well, I think one of the things we're all agreeing on is that Schedule III is not the last stop on the road. that this is the next stop in what will be a continued conversation about the benefits of cannabis, about how to manage the risks, because everything has risk, and having those transparent conversations, and allowing people to have access to products that are safe, that are tested in a system that supports businesses and those that are trying to make access happen. And again, you activists out there, your job is not over. We have to keep pressure on the change makers, on the lawmakers, to make sure that this isn't the last stop. And then we continue on to the place that we are all discussing. So with that, Michael, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all the time the panelists have taken to consider this issue and take part in this webinar. Thank you again to Joanna Hossack and Peng Lor for the organization and thoroughness in pulling this together, and also to the Resources Legacy Fund for their enduring support. I want to say, next month, we're going to be kicking off our Brown Bag series with California-based researchers, beginning with Dr. Thomas Aswell on the wild world of hemp and its entanglements with the broader cannabis landscape. The series is going to take place every other Friday at noon Pacific time, starting on October 4th. We're going to be reposting this webinar to our YouTube channel, which you can access on our link tree listed on the next slide. There's a QR code on the right of the screen that you can also get to the link tree through. It should have links to all of our other social media, which you're invited to follow. You can also sign up for our newsletter with the QR code on the left-hand side. And we'll leave this page up for a few minutes so people can link as needed. Finally, a big thank you to all of our audience for being a part of this event. We're really looking forward to more. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Take care.